Hello, hello! Welcome to what I hope is going to be a short video, but probably won't be, knowing me. But this time around, I thought that, for the sake of doing a short little video, I would talk a little bit about the nature of drafting, because I kind of figured that's probably the thing that most people have the most trouble with and need the most help doing. Because, sure, it's nice actually seeing someone draw a complete image, and that's all well and good, but usually the foundation for errors and the foundations for success lie in how much time that you spend working on the initial draft of anything, whether it's a drawing or whatever it happens to be. Also, people tend to, young artists especially, tend to focus on the wrong things. And I did the same thing whenever I was younger. For example, I thought that brushes were absolutely everything in regards to whether or not a drawing is going to look good or not. Like, whenever I was first starting out, I was really having a lot of trouble with Photoshop and that sort of thing. And I thought, well, it's just because people are using these very specialized brushes that I don't have access to. That's certainly got to be it, right? And people do the same thing with, like, Cintiqs, whether they have the right kind of tablet or not. No. First things first, people ask me sometimes what sort of tablet should I get. It doesn't matter. I started on a little $99 incredibly tiny Wacom. That was just fine. I could probably still use it today and it would not matter. I have a Cintiq now, but that's just because it's useful for a variety of things since I'm sitting at my desk all the time. And it's just generally useful. Will it really improve your art at all? Probably not much. Actually, whenever I first started working on my Cintiq, I actually thought that I was actually doing worse than I was otherwise. Alright. But I've left this up on the screen. I screen capped this for the sake of people that ask about these sort of things. So that's there for those that want it. You can go back to the first of the video in case I have it off for too long. But this is typically the draft pencil that I use. Here's what it looks like. And you notice that it tapers off whenever I let up on the amount of pressure that I'm putting down. And you'll also notice that the density is sort of, like, it's not incredibly low. Like, this is 70 right now. If I were to put this on, like, 20 or so, it would be much, much lighter. I personally don't like it that way. I could put it all the way up to 100, which would have, maximum amount of density. The reason why I have it at 70 is because I personally, and this is not a right or wrong statement, this is just my preference, I personally like to have my lines so that I have enough leverage to where if I want to let up on the pressure, then it's still recognizably a line. But it's also hard enough that I can actually establish that there's a line there if I want it to. With 100%, it becomes a lot more difficult to ensure that your pressure sensitivity is correct. This is another thing. If you're working in Photoshop and you find that you have no pressure sensitivity, that's a problem with your setup in Photoshop. Like there's a lot of setup problems that I'm not going to go into for individual programs, but you're probably going to, if you're just like starting out, you're probably going to have to spend like a day or two just trying to figure that out. And I know it's irritating, but you'll eventually get it set up and it will be over. For now, until you find more things to worry about. But, that's another story. Alright, but as far as actual settings go, I'm not going to go down, like, everything, but just a general idea that, in terms of drafting, this is what I go for. Like, there's nothing special about this. And, I'm working in Paint Tool Psi, and Paint Tool Psi is good for what I do. In Photoshop, the settings will obviously be different, but the same principles will remain. Work with something that has a brush that has a pretty good solid core to it. That is, like, usually a Photoshop brush will look something like this, sort of. Hold on for a second. I'll make one. It'll look something like this, usually. Like, there'll be a very hard center, but then there'll be, like, a little radial around the edge. And that can be good or bad, because I'll use this as a demonstration. You could end up with a brush that sort of looks like this all the time, and that's probably really no good for doing final line work, certainly, and it may be kind of a pain in the ass as far as drafting goes. You want it to have sort of a solid core to the middle. That way, you sort of know what you're working with, right? because whenever you want to put down a draft line, you want to be able to actually look and be able to identify the stroke that you're putting down. Like you also say whenever I'm doing my draft, since I've talked about this before, but there's traditional strokes and then there's digital strokes. In terms of how people have learned, I learned on a pencil and paper, so I do a lot of this, a lot of working up the line to make it actually solid. That way I don't really have to commit to anything, because whenever you're working on a pencil and paper, then you there's no undo button, right? So the only thing you can do is erase it. But on a pencil and paper, if you erase, then you can leave residual marks. You could tear the paper, just any number of things. So you sort of end up learning to work this way. Whereas people that learn digital tend to just, oh, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work. And they just keep doing that over and over and over again. So usually you can tell digital artists because their final line work will be very, like it's very, there's no, vitality to the line work. It's just very static, hard. Everything is very either flowing or, is especially jagged or something. Like there's not much identity to it. It looks like it was done on a computer for a reason, because the person that's doing it learned on a computer. So that's drafting. I wanted to go through at least 3 of these brush types. The next one I guess I will mention is probably the pencil. I'm not going to go over my binary pen, because that's just binary. It doesn't really matter too much. Like the thing about binary line, and Photoshop does have this. I think it's just called the pen tool. I can't remember. But a binary line, I've been over this before. You notice there's no variation. Like there's no aliasing or anything going on. There's just light and dark. May as well use black for doing this. There's just light and dark. It's either there or it's not there. That's what binary means, that can be really useful. I really like doing that for if I establish a line work or something. Like let's say that I draw a little box here and I want to fill this in with a thing under it. Then I can just use my binary tool and just do it this way. And that makes it easier because whenever I want to select this area for later, like if I'm doing shading or something on this area, I can just wand select it and it selects absolutely everything. Because if you were wand selecting, say, like this area, then, you can't quite get everything because it's aliased. Like this area is sort of white, but it's not. So if you select there, then it's not going to get everything. And it's going to have this overlap so that you have to worry about whether it's fitting within its container or not, that sort of thing. Whereas with binary, since there is no such thing, then it just gets everything. It's not perfect 100% of the time, because you'll notice that even then with the selection, you can still see that the selection itself wants to create aliasing on the edge. So sometimes it will create some problems, but it's pretty rare comparatively. Alright. So, drafting. That's the point of drafting. Binary pen. The pencil I use, not always. I've actually been getting more away from this over time. I've actually been using the draft pencil for my final line work in a lot of cases because I like the softer look that the draft has. And I could adjust the brush for this reason, but in Paint Tool size specifically, you can actually create new brushes, I think by right-clicking, and it has presets, with the basis of it being either a pencil, an airbrush, a brush, watercolor brush, mark eraser, just various things. And once you make one of those, you can edit its settings and everything. But the core function of what it is never really changes. And the same thing sort of works in Photoshop. Like a brush is different from a pen, and that is different from an airbrush or something like that. And that's just programming. That's just how they make the program. I can't do anything about that. This is how it is. Find a tool that works and then create something that works within the confines of that tool. The pencil itself I was using more so for doing final line work. And right now you can tell it has sort of this jaggedness to the side of it. And that's because right now I'm using this spread of noise filter. This is default, by the way. Uh, the one in Paint Tool side comes with different ones. Hold on. Like this is Spread, for example. This is Spread and Noise, which is the one I typically use. Bristle. And you can't really tell, but like at the very edges down here, you can tell there's a little bit of a bristle down here. It can be useful ever so often. And Flat Bristle. And you can create or download more of these, that sort of thing. And this is the default one with nothing added to it. So you can see why this will be useful for final line work. And you could also see, after I just got through complaining about how digital line work can sometimes look lifeless as a result of doing this, you can see why I have kind of gotten away from doing this. Because there's not much life on the edges of this. And there's not much working up to it. Right now I have the density up really high. I could probably reduce this down to 80. And it's not quite as bad in this case. Like, say, if I'm working up the brush as opposed to working up the draft, and this is also 70, you can see, like, I have less control over the draft. And that's sort of its limitation. Because the brush is made for this sort of thing. Like, it's made for these very hard, controlled strokes. Whereas the draft is obviously made for drafting. And actually, it's not called the draft. I just named it that because that's what I use it for. I forget what basis this one has. I think it might actually be an altered... Yeah, I actually can't remember which one I base this off of. Because there's pencil, airbrush, brush itself. I think I may have based it off of a brush, but you can create these and edit these willy-nilly. You can do the same thing, sort of thing in Photoshop as well. But you guys get the idea. Use a different tool for different things. Like, one single thing is not going to solve every single problem, right? The last one I want to talk about was the blending color one. And, don't need that. You can see what this is for. It doesn't really matter what the settings are necessarily. What matters more so in me going over these things is that I'm using generally 3 approaches to making a drawing. One is something that I can use to draft, that I have a lot of control over, that I can work up an image using, so I don't have to worry too much about what I'm doing. Then I'll have something that is more of a step 2 in terms of finalizing what I'm working with and sort of shaping it, giving it more volume, more of an identity. And then the last one would be like I use this as a paintbrush, essentially. And this one, you can see what it's doing. You can use this to sort of blur things together. In real life, there is a tortilla that you can use, which is just basically a twisted up piece of paper. It's essentially what it is. And you use that mainly in something like charcoal drawings and that sort of thing. And use it to push around the color. Like, hold on, let me actually work in black and white for a second. Let's say that you're like drawing a picture of a guy's face or something. And you're like saying, like, here's eyes, his nose, that sort of thing. And then you write something. You guys get the idea. Can focus on the actual. Anytime I start doing something, I want to kind of work it up. But like, let's say that this is like eyes and mouth and a nose. Sorry. So you would need a way to sort of pull and push this around, like if you were doing sort of a shading area, and you don't want this to be hard, like this cheekbone area. You want this to be more shaped up, but you don't want this to be. That sort of thing. Then you use a tortilla, or in this case, my blending color tool, or whatever you want to use in a Photoshop. Photoshop doesn't do this quite as well. You can sort of do it, but it's... In Photoshop, I've talked about this before, but what you end up having to do is use a brush that has this sort of outside blurred radius, like the draft does to some degree, and you just end up having to sample the color over and over and over again. Like you drop, sample the edge, do that again, and then you just keep trying to find that ideal color in the middle until you actually get the blending that you actually want, which is kind of a pain in the ass. I hate doing it. It can be effective. You can do it in Photoshop, but it's just not particularly ideal. It also has a blur tool, which Sai also has a blur tool. And I use this for whenever I pulled the color down as much as I want to, but it's not really blending the way that I want it to. So I use this to sort of finalize the area in case I'm ever doing any painting, which I don't really paint that much, so it doesn't matter. But you guys get the idea. I can't use the same tool for every single thing. I can't use the same brush for every single thing. You have to use variants in these things. Alright. So those are the tools that we're working with. Again, the settings for each one of those is at the first of the video. I'm not going to go over them, all of them. But the main thing probably for me is just density mainly, or opacity, whatever the setting name is. Blending is going, like each one of the, I can't afford to go over every single one of these things, but you get the idea. Also inside there's a stabilizer setting that you can use. I have mine at 12. You don't necessarily have to have it on anything. But you can you can almost sort of pick up what it does. Like if I set that to 0, and that's a 0, and let's go up to like 15. You may not be able to tell any difference. But basically what it's doing is just ensuring that there's less variation in the way that you're applying the stroke. That way it gives you more control in a digital landscape, as opposed to what you would have in real life. So, having a stabilizer, like, it's good to have a stabilizer if the program has a setting, but you don't need it. A lot of people, I imagine, were looking at that and it's like, I can't see a thing. There's nothing different about it to me. That's fine. It's one of those things that probably you may not notice at all whenever you're working. Alright, tried to explain that as fast as I possibly could. The next thing, I wanted to go over that, and I'm not going to do a full image, but I wanted to do a little bit of a draft, I guess, just to sort of go over form. This next part, I was kind of struggling to think how in the world to explain this. Because the next thing that people usually have the most problem with is how to do their draft in the first place. And it kind of depends on what you're doing. If you're doing a really zoomed out... If you're doing something that's really zoomed out, you might want to use something that's a bit lower in size. Like, if you're drafting something that's... will eventually require a lot of detail, then you don't want to have something that's just a blob, necessarily. You can... This is more of a personal thing. Like, as long as you can recognize what it is that you're trying to draw. Like, say, where I'm going to do a tree or something. And if you want to draft like this, I mean, you can. But you can see what the limitation in doing something so huge is. Whereas if you do the exact opposite, 0.7 width brush here, and you want to do it this way, this also has its own limitations. Because now it's almost like you're just drawing the final image. And there's not enough width to the individual lines for you to really work up the area to give it more definition, because that's the point of doing a draft. You're trying to work up areas in order to understand the form that you're trying to apply to the page. So typically I will do something in the middle. It doesn't actually... Which number is it? Which number is it? Tell me there... I don't know. It doesn't matter. Just as long as it's something that you can sort of work up with and you see what it is that you're trying to do, and it doesn't really matter. Shitty ass tree. You get the idea. Just as long as it's something that you can work with, that you can see from the distance that you have from your monitor, but also isn't too big or isn't too small. Again, if you can work like that, just looking at blobs, that's fine. A lot of people that paint over everything instead of doing line illustrations work that way. They just apply a huge blob of color to an area, and they can see it on their own. They don't need it, because the thing with painting is that you're naturally going to be working an area anyways, so that form will sort of come out on its own over time. So some people do that, but I usually see painters still work with a loose sort of like area. Like, even there's a lot of famous paintings where they show the draft and like there's this big elaborate thing where there's like a bunch of trees and a lake here, and there's a cabin or whatever. And then you see where the kid was. Like there's a painting of a kid over here. And then you see the draft, and it looks exactly like this. Like, I'm not even kidding. Like, it just looks like this. That's because the whole point of drawing it is not that you're going to use this at all. It's just like you're drawing something like occupied space here. And that's all your brain is seeing. You're just saying, well, this area goes here. You could may as well just be drawing, like, boxes. Because that's essentially what you're doing. Just, this is the area in which these things shall take place. And if you've ever taken any sort of art class, you might be used to the idea of seeing things in terms of perspective in the negative and positive space, and that's what this is, essentially. Like, you can draw it like that, and it doesn't really matter, as long as it makes sense to you. What really matters in terms of that is just the weight of the space that you're using. Alright, but back to what I was trying to do. I figured may as well finish this off by trying to draw Princess Peach this time. I'll do that. And to that end, I thought, instead of trying to draw her whole body, which I figured would be a bad idea, I would instead try to draw just her head. Let's do that. Something that I actually almost considered doing another Sonic character, because I wanted to demonstrate, and always flip your canvas, kids, one of those lessons that I feel like I probably say too much, but also not really. Always flip your canvas. Someone was actually on stream the other day and wanted to know why I kept flipping my canvas all the time. And that is because, like, hold on, let me just do this again. Let's say I draw something and it looks like I draw that and I say, oh, it almost looks like a perfect circle. There, okay, yeah. I draw this and it's like, oh, it's a perfect circle, whatever. It's not a perfect circle, but just work with me here. But I flip it, and then I see, oh, it's not. Like, you see more whenever you flip the canvas. I've talked about this before, but whenever you start drawing things, sometimes you'll start skewing it to one side because you're leaning to one side and you don't realize that you're doing it. Especially if you're working on a traditional desk, sometimes you will be standing the wrong position, sitting the wrong position, the paper might be tilted to one side and you didn't realize it. 100 different reasons for it, but the end result is that everything ends up being skewed. So whenever you flip it, you suddenly realize how bad it looks, and that allows you to move things to where they need to be, and then it's fine. That's why you need to flip your canvas. Do that constantly. Get in the habit of doing that. Okay, but Princess Peach. Since it's just a zoomed-in picture, I think it'd be best if I used sort of a heavy draft. Some people struggle with, like, even like this. Like, a lot of people just struggle getting to this phase. Because a lot of people will do things like, they'll see the eyes first, and they'll try to do like this, and they can't quite figure it out, and like, well, it sort of goes over here, and a head is sort of generally shaped like this or something. So it ends up being this wonky mess. And a lot of that is just practice. Like, I'm not going to pretend. A lot of it is practice. Working on proportion is one of the things that I'm most known for. Proportion and, like, line and things like that. So me being able to just rip through a draft as fast as possible shouldn't be that much of a surprise, and you having any problems with it also shouldn't be that much of a surprise. I would endorse the idea that actually trying to work on something, like don't worry about making the final version of it already, right? Just enjoy actually getting there. Because that's actually, the drafting phase is probably the phase that I enjoy the most out of drawing. I really don't like doing the final line work in color. I enjoy doing the draft. And you see here, I'm doing my little guidelines here. I'm just looking at a picture of her and going, well, her general facial shape is sort of like this. And it sort of looks like, it does look like she has, it's slightly more of an almond shape. So you see here, like, I have left a little bit too much there. I'm actually going to reduce my density down to 60 in this case. That way I can work up a little bit more. And you can erase if you want to. It doesn't really matter too much. But you have to, if you're working with an existing character, it kind of becomes... I kind of picked Peach. Like I said, I was going to do a Sonic character, because Sonic characters notoriously are extremely difficult to draw, despite the fact that they're so simple. They're just like spheres and like simple shapes. But the distance between their eyes and the way that you draw them, especially, and the proportions like between their mouth and their nose and so forth and so on, are so incredibly exact that if you get them even a little bit wrong, it gets really fucked up looking. So I was thinking about doing it that way, but I decided against it. I'm just going to get rid of this real fast. Let's see, what do I want to do, actually? Do something, and you don't even really have to... I'm probably committing to it a little bit too much. So I ended up picking Peach sort of as a challenge to myself, because she actually also is sort of hard to draw. Like, you can see what I did here. Like, all these lines over here, I'm not even going to use those lines. But that was just part of the draft. It was just working up until I got to the spot where I'm like, oh, this is the line that I wanted to use. So in the case of this, details for the face will require more exactness than my current draft pencil can provide at its current shape and size, but it can do this much. And actually, I shouldn't even be doing it this way. I'm already progressing too much because I'm trying to hurry. So really what I'm going to do is first decide where I want the facial placement to actually be. And then I'll start worrying about the facial details and everything later. So for now, let's just do this. She has little collar things that are somewhere in this area. Her nose will probably be somewhere right here, which means that her mouth will probably be somewhere right here. Not going to commit to it yet. Let's see. I'm not going to draw her eyes. I think most of it is her eyes. Because anytime that a character has these big sort of bug eyes, it's kind of a pain for me. When I don't really draw big moe eyes that much in the first place. Plus, it's easy to sort of screw them up. Just because, it's easy to screw up big eyes like this because there's too much white of the eyes that it makes them look crazy. Like if I were to get rid of this and like do like this or something. She looks nuts, absolutely nuts. So you have to be extremely careful about it. If you occupy too much space, then it ends up also looking crazy. So if you ever had that problem, that's what's going on. It's just that the proportionality of the way everything's sort of intersecting is pretty weird. And it seems like she's like this. So it'll be sort of like this, I imagine. Yeah. And since this is sort of an upward shot, her chin will actually end here, but we'll have like sort of a little indentation area. And I'll go down like that. I think I'll actually pull this down some. And I can't explain every single thing that I'm doing here. Some of these decisions are not even correct decisions. They're simply decisions that I'm making spur of the moment. Doesn't really matter too much. I'm not going to save this picture one way or the other, so it doesn't really matter to me. This is sort of the general area that her hair comes down. And it does overlap, so it'll be somewhere in sort of this region. I'm not really used to drawing her too much, so this is not going to come out just right. Especially not in draft. So I'm not too worried. But I am sort of confident that the general idea should be good enough for the time being. I think I actually pull that back. It'll be sort of in this area. Really the thing that makes her look most Peach-like is probably that little forward dagger of her bangs of her hair. It's probably the most thing that actually does it. And I'm probably going to have to shrink this down, the whole thing, or else I won't be able to get enough of the idea in. I don't want to focus too much on details. You notice this is not where her hair intersects, but what I'm doing here is sort of making sort of an exterior guideline. Just because I figure, well, this area is going to extend past this, and like I'm looking at the original image, and this one will be like right here, but since I've created a guideline that I'm sort of confident in, that I can use this as a makeshift way of ensuring that everything is sort of sized up to where it should be, if that makes sense to you. And her crown goes somewhere around here. Her Burger King crown, because she eats fresh, or whatever the fuck their stupid logo, whatever they're saying is. So it's sort of like that, I guess. Shape up that head a little bit. You can sort of see the errors that I'm making as I see them as well. And her hair does this weird thing where it's... I really don't like it whenever characters have big blob hair. Like, I like spikiness to some degree, but whenever it gets too congested, it becomes difficult to draw. Because it's just a basic shape, and I have sort of this weird intermediate between it being realistic and cartoony. So whenever it gets too aggressive, it actually interferes with the work. And our sort of little earring things kind of go in this area, I guess. Doesn't look exactly like her, but it's sort of getting there. And again, I'm not going to complete this, but you get the general idea. But it does sort of look like her, I guess. And she does her little shoulder things. I'm not going to draw her dress. But it will help to know that it's there, I guess. So if all that's there, then this should be the final little hair thing, little doodad. A lot of characters sort of had Christmas tree hair, if you think about it. You should look for that sometime, whenever you're looking at character designs. Notice how many of them had this sort of Christmas tree thing going on, where it kind of furls out, really furls out, and then it kind of disappears with the shoulders. It's a good look. I'm not criticizing it. I'm just saying that a lot of people have it. Alright, so that's sort of that. It looks like actually the hair probably doesn't need to be shifted somehow. Sort of like that, I guess. It helps to look at it in terms of it being an object. If you didn't know, Princess Peach is called Princess Peach. It's a Japanese thing, but it's mainly a Chinese thing. It's mythology that they inherited from China. I forget the name of the woman it's based off of, the goddess that it's based off of. But there's basically a goddess that sort of plays with mortals and is basically just a very bored elder god, essentially. And that's sort of the general thing with Peach. It's implied that she can handle anything that Bowser throws at her, but she's kind of just bored and is just looking for things to do and allows herself to be kidnapped because it's fun. And her name comes back to that because of some old myth involving peaches and the power of peaches that came out of China. It's very, very old. I'd recommend looking it up sometime. It's sort of interesting, but apparently not interesting enough for me to remember it. Which I most certainly do not. Alright, so, primary draft. I've noticed I've watched some people draw and they'll do one draft and then they'll start their final line work. And I'm like, no sir, you can't do that. That's not a good idea. You need to do several drafts, good sir. That would be a good idea. I have seen people complain whenever they have to do more than one draft, but that's most of the fun. It's doing the draft phase, so why wouldn't you want to do multiple versions of it? And that's probably one reason why my final line work actually ends up coming out looking good. Because if I did like a final line work over this, like imagine this, if I did final line work over this, then it would probably look like shit, right? But if I did this several more times, eventually I'm going to get it right. It'll just take a little bit more time. And it'll take a few more iterations. And part of the experience, especially if you're doing a character that you have not created, a lot of the experience is just going over the character, evaluating, why is this not working? Why is this not working? Why is this not working? This part of the character does this. Oh, I did this. And the more time that you spend with the character, the more that you're going to learn about their design. And as a result, the more success that you will have with that character over the long run. Whereas if you're just rushing and just trying to get through the drawing as fast as you possibly can, of course it's not going to be successful. So as a result, this is the importance of doing a draft. This is the importance of spending more time working with that draft phase. And I'm not going to draft her lips too much. Because I've mentioned this before, but like her lips do not have anywhere near this amount of strength to them. But you can't really draw lines for lips because they're not actually lines, they're color. So as a result, they need the sort of fade. So it's kind of hard to work with that if it comes up sometimes. You sort of just want to add lines where it would be the most indented, just to remind yourself this is where color needs to go eventually. And Peach, sort of looking at her, she has this sort of weird nose where, like, she doesn't really have a defined nose. It's not like she just has a big honking American, like, super nose. She has this very, I'm designed by a Japanese person nose, where it's almost so flat that it's almost non-existent, and you can't really even see it because of the way that they shade it. So it sort of just fades in. But you can sort of cheat, so I'll just sort of cheat and say, it's kind of in this area, and that'll be good enough for now. Again, her eyes are the big problem. I'm looking at the shape of her eyes right now. They're not... They sort of have a little bit of that, sort of a I'm a sexy lady, sort of almond, like tilted almond shape to them. A little bit. The bottoms aren't straight. They drop down a little bit. If you make them go up like that, it gives them a completely different sort of expression. Eyes are very important, as I always say. So eyes are probably the one that you'll spend the most time doing, the most time getting wrong, in fact. And that's fine. If there's any spot in a character that really drives me crazy and makes me want to abandon a drawing entirely, which doesn't happen too much to me these days, but it does happen, it's usually the eyes. It's usually something that's going wrong with the eyes. And it usually only happens with characters like this, sort of, that don't really fit my style exactly. So as a result, they're the ones I just have the most trouble dealing with. And especially with Peach, a character like this, it's gone through so many iterations in the first place. She also has a lot of different models that they've made over the years. A lot of different iterations. Let me shore this up a little bit. Like this is the case. Her eye is a little bit tilted to one side, I think. So whenever you pull up reference material for a character like this, you can actually run into the problem of one sheet not matching another, one model not quite matching another. And as a result, you can end up with some sort of tilted designs as a result of that as well. Let's do it like that. And that sort of looks like her, I think. Again, most important thing is the eyes. A little bit of that, a little bit of this. Her eyebrows are really strange. They're very condensed. There's not much to them. I think actually this one eye is probably a little bit bigger than it should be. And I wanted to do this live just to give you an idea of how many very minor mistakes I'm making. Like that's the main reason why I'm doing this. Is not to show you, oh, look what I can do. It's more just showing you this is what I'm fucking up. And like right here, I think actually that needs to come over a little bit. And as a result of that, this line needs to come down some. There we go. Because you can... I hope that makes sense whenever I do things like that. Because I'm still following... I'm not looking at the guideline necessarily. I'm just, in my mind, I'm visualizing a line right here. And actually, as a result, her mouth looks like it should come over a little bit. And also... transform it and tilt a little bit to one side. And that looks slightly more natural to me. And actually, it probably needs to go over like one more pixel. But not two, just one. It's right there, I think. And that should be good. Alright. And some iterations of her character design, actually, her hair kind of curves rather than forms a little spike there. Which is kind of strange. Notice with her lips, too. she has this sort of, like, if you get rid of the lipstick, then actually she has this little kitty mouth. And her lips actually, they don't form like a perfect circle or anything, but they almost do. Like it has a very oval shape. So that's something to keep in mind as well. That's one of the things that makes her look like her. You can probably find a picture online of Princess Peach with the texture on her lips removed, and it makes her look much different. She still looks cute. No, make no mistake. But she does look different. So, I remember, like, I was trying to pull the hair all the way down here, but that's not actually what it does. Her hair actually comes down to sort of like right here. And then there's a secondary little blade where you'll get cut, bitch. It comes all the way down here. And this is also a good habit to get in, is looking at... is trying to identify place... how do I say this? Whenever you're looking at the model of something, identify placement. Like in the case of where do I draw this ear, for example. I'm looking at the original picture, and in the original picture, her ear, the top of the ear does not match the top of the eye. It's slightly below it, but the hair actually, her little thing right here, actually hits the very top of her ear. So since she's looking up slightly, the ear will actually drop down a little bit, and it'll be sort of right around this area. And you can just make out the ear, no matter what her model is, it sort of peeks out a little bit right here. Never has much definition to it, and which means that her big thing, her giant earring orb of power, doesn't actually go over here, it's more down here. I think it's actually a little bit bigger than that. So it would be somewhere in this area, and it does have some shading to it. Do that for later. For the later, that will never come because I'm not going to finish this. And I said that this is where the little blade comes in, the little hair blade. So that almost lined up perfectly with the original draft, which actually is kind of surprising. And because her hair is... like, they get away with this really easily. Since you usually see her as a 3D model instead of a drawing, then a lot of the times her model is just a blob. Like, there's no definition to her hair. There's just a big shape that sort of eats into itself where all the polygons are mixing. So there's no, like, line here. It just sort of keeps going into itself. Which you can't cheat. You have to recognize that whenever you're looking at it. You have to actually notice, oh, there's nothing here. Because whenever you end up replicating it with a drawing, then you have to try to come up with a compromise. Like, unless you want to paint the whole thing, in which case you may as well just look at a picture of the model. Right? Like, if you're just going to replicate the whole thing, just look at the original. The whole point of redrawing it is to make it slightly different in a new and original way. Whenever you're doing that, you have to accommodate that. So in the case of this hair, like on the model, it just goes into it. There is like a little visible seam. So whenever I do the actual line work, what I would probably end up doing is just having a little bit go over to the side. And if I do any sort of detail work with the hair, which I probably wouldn't, then I would keep it away from this area. I would make sure that I didn't do anything too heavy in this area or right here, because it would draw too much attention to it. And since the eye is used to seeing Peach without this area sort of obscured in this particular case, then if you do it in an illustration, the eye will also see it. It won't. The person's that's looking at it won't understand what they're looking at, but they will say to themselves, something's not right about this picture, but I don't get what it is. And it'll be an accumulation of little things like that, because they're just used to seeing it. What are the hardest things that you can actually draw? And I always hated whenever people ask me... Sometimes people would commission me or whatever back in the day to draw... I don't do commissions anymore, so don't ask. People would ask me to draw either themselves or someone that they knew. And I would always tell them that is not going to go the way that you think it is. That does not work that way. Because especially if it's yourself or a loved one or someone that you're used to seeing, even a charcoal drawing that someone painstakingly spends hours and hours, it's not going to look the same because you're just too used to seeing it. And every like minor variation that the person that has never seen them before, but you're commissioning to draw them, it's already 45 minutes. Whenever they're drawing it, they of course don't know what that person looks like. They're just going off of one photograph. They don't have a lifetime of looking in a mirror. So whenever you look at it yourself and you're used to seeing yourself, of course you're going to say, that doesn't look right, and I don't know what it is. Now, there's a reason for that. Same thing goes with like cartoon characters or 3D models or whatever. You have to try to... You can't try to make it exactly the same... whatever. You can't try to make it exactly the same, but you should at least be aware of whenever you're doing your drafts. That should be the phase of the drawing in which you're actually coming to a better understanding of the subject matter that you're working with. That's the point of doing a draft. It's not just getting the drawing right, it's actually coming to a better understanding of your subject matter. Alright, so I think we're at sort of the phase where I'm just like, well, just doing some shape-up work here. It's mainly the face that's the biggest problem. Peach's big, dumb, beautiful face. I actually much prefer Rosalina. Because, you know, who doesn't? She's a giant. She's a giant lady. And she also has a backstory. Unlike Peach, who just sort of exists to be rescued most of the time. She has sort of an attitude. And she's got some personality to her, but she doesn't have a story, which is pretty weird. But anyways. That's how you do it. Again, this is not final line work, so it doesn't matter. But just, here's the general place where shoulders would be. Alright, so each draft should be an iteration on success. Each time that you fail at something, it should be a moderate step towards success in some way, even if it ends up looking worse. Because sometimes you can draw something, or whatever it is, and it will actually end up being shittier than the first time you did it. But just like evaluating the physical model, evaluating your drawing and the process of doing those drawings should also be an effort to understand yourself and why you're making the decisions that you're making in regards to your own drawing. It's just a position that you put yourself in to grow and to self-evaluate. That's part of drawing as well. Alright. So, here we are. Final, quote-unquote, draft. Sometimes I like to play with the skewing and everything to sort of give a little bit more life. This, I seem to condense her a little bit too much. This is another advantage of a draft, is you can do things like this and it doesn't matter too much. Pull her up a little bit. Yeah, she looks a little bit better if she's a little bit wider in that respect. Alright, so there you go. Here's my crummy Princess Peach for the time being. But more importantly, that's how you go about drafting for the most part. Is just working with it like that. So, self-evaluate, don't commit to anything, be sure to use the correct tools for whatever it is that you're trying to do, don't worry too much about getting things wrong, it doesn't really matter too much, identify the model that you're working with, try to make yourself better in the process. So there you go. And, goodbye Peach, never forget that it doesn't really matter. You can delete everything and it just doesn't matter. Never commit to anything. That's what I always say. Goodbye, Peach. Alright. Hello, Chinese mountain range. See you guys next time.